back, I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Review, where we use our AI, DesignEye, to analyse an old competition piece of mine and give me some feedback on how it meets the principles and elements of design, which is how we are judged in competition, as well as some suggestions for improving the design in some way. This week the design was for an online competition. The title was On the Edge, and it was a 70 centimetre width with height unlimited. With online competitions, sometimes you have the opportunity to have it judged from the front and the side, so you've got to take more than one photo, but I think as their popularity has increased, the organisers have limited it to one image. So what you've got to be careful of there is that you are sending the best image you possibly can. So it's good to experiment with where you can take your photo, the lighting for it, because you don't want shadow on it, on the background of where your design is. All of those sorts of things you need to take into consideration, so your design is not going to look the same as it does in real life. So you really need to make sure that you emphasize the depth of your design by having that image look as appropriate as it possibly can in terms of the judging criteria. So for this design, I used some stacked pieces of cardboard. It was at the stage where we were just being allowed to use paper products as plant-based material within designs. So I've used the stacked corrugated cardboard in different heights. I've used a wire mesh frame as part of the design to allow me to have things on the edge of that framework, and so the placements were always on the edge of the mesh or on the edge of the cardboard. So I've used Banksia flowers, Banksia slices, and some Cresspedia, some Billy Buttons, and some wheat, just to keep it within that one colour palette, and of course to ensure that I got all of the textures that I wanted. So we've got the smooth and shiny in the mesh, we've got the flat and smooth in the cardboard, we've got the rougher textures of the Banksia, and to a lesser extent the Cresspedia and the light and airy stuff with the wheat. So the design didn't place in the competition. It was an international competition, and so I would have been over the moon had it placed, because it is very difficult when you are competing at a world level to get the nuances of each country has a very different design development phases, and so I was a little bit concerned when I submitted it that perhaps there was too much of the cardboard in there wasn't enough plant material. We didn't get any feedback, so I don't really know what else the judges were looking for, and it might just have been that there wasn't enough material in it. So I'm interested to see on this occasion what the feedback is in terms of the principles and elements of design, as well as what the suggestions are, because obviously it needs something else. And as I look at it now, I know one thing that I have not done that I should have done, and I think I berate you all about this in all of the videos I make, and it's about the base. I haven't put it on a base, so the design looks like the black cloth is incorporated into the design, which it's not, and so that's a detracting point, and that might have been all it needed. So let's now see what DesignEye's got to say, so I know what to do next time. Looking individually at the principles and elements of design, first of all, we'll look at line. Line is a dominant feature seen primarily through the use of vertical corrugated cardboard pieces and the vertical alignment of plant materials like wheat and seed heads. The lines are clean, mostly upright, conveying a sense of upward movement, possibly symbolising structures on the edge of a city or nature reclaiming space. The inclusion of the wire mesh introduces a subtle grid line element, adding structure without overpowering. And actually what I had in mind was the cityscape. So looking from the edge of the city, looking towards the city, because when I travel to Sydney, that's what I see. I see the buildings lined up on the edge of the skyline, I guess is the best way to describe it. So it's interesting that the AI analysis has picked up that as perhaps that's what it means, because that's indeed what I was thinking when I was putting the design together. Form. The design is composed of mostly linear and elongated forms, cardboard stacks, vertical plant materials, with a few rounded forms, the seed heads and Billy Buttons or the Cresspedia. providing form contrast. The overall form is open and airy with minimal massing, relying on the repetition of slender forms to convey the theme. And that might be something that could be improved, including some massing of the plant material, because it is very spaced out, that the way it looks at this point in time. I still like it as a design, but it might be improved by massing some of that plant material rather than having it all as the vertical placements. Texture, my very favourite. Texture is exceptionally well handled. Rough textures of cardboard edges and spiky seed heads contrast with the smooth wire grid and softer wheat heads. The mix of natural plant textures with the manufactured texture of corrugated cardboard creates a compelling tension between nature and industrial materials appropriate for an edge theme. I'm always happy to hear that I've nailed the texture, contrast and handled texture well, because I think texture is one of the things that draws me to floral art and to floral design, is that there are just so many textures available and you can really get a contrast in a design just with texture alone without having to look at any of the other materials. And I think in one of the earlier videos I talked about finding which of the design principles and elements is your happy place, is the thing that resonates best with you, and focusing on that and making that a strength of your designs. And that's what I do with texture. Colour. The natural earthy palette dominated by browns and golds contributes to the rawness of the design. The small pops of yellow from the billy buttons provide an effective accent colour, adding vibrancy without disturbing the overall unity. And that would be an issue, I think, if I moved away from the colour palette. So if I tried to mass some plant material, it might be an issue having the green in there, so having some foliage in there, because it would detract from that, the rawness and the unity that is achieved by having it all in that one colour palette. Something that I'd have to play with, and we'll see if it's in the suggestions for improvement as well. Space. Good use of negative space, particularly with the open mesh grid and the vertical spacing between the materials. This openness prevents the design from feeling heavy despite the density of cardboard blocks at the base. So that's a good tip as well, is that I've got, you might have a very heavy container. Here I've got the visually heavier base in terms of the cardboard blocks, and so keeping it light, the rest of it light and airy, and using the space between the placements as part of the design makes it overall a better use of the actual space for the design itself. Balance. The design achieves asymmetrical balance. Heavier visual weight is on the left with the denser cardboard and plant material, but it's balanced by the taller, finer elements on the right. The upright posture of most elements provides good visual stability. And that, once again, an interesting thing to learn about balance in a design is that we will have heavier visual weight with denser plant material placements. And how do we balance that in a design, or how do we get away from having it just a completely heavy looking design, or a completely spaced out looking design by not having the heavier materials there? So it's a good exercise in visual balance to look at heavy or massed placement on one side, and how do I balance that with moving the eye through somewhere light and area, so that overall in the unity of the design we feel that it is balanced. Rhythm. Rhythm is created by repetition of cardboard layers and vertical botanical elements. The eye is encouraged to travel upward, reflecting the edge or boundary theme. Curved placements of some of the seed heads prevent stiffness and add visual flow. And I think what they're talking about, the seed heads there, is the Banksia flowers. And I actually think that they might have slipped a little bit, that they should have been a little bit straighter on. But that said, obviously that's something that I have to take away from the analysis, is that what has happened in the placement where they have been curved is that it's actually helped the design rather than hindered it. And I guess the question that will be uppermost in some people's minds is, doesn't having so many vertical placements take your eye out of the design? And I think what happens if you look at it is that, yes, you're taken up into the design, but because in the corner of your eye you've got that heavier base placement, you are brought back down to that as the focal area. So without having to have the movement, the curving around movement that brings you travel, makes you travel through the design, there are things that you are drawn to look at without having a line to follow. Dominance. The dominant area is clearly the cluster of vertical cardboard and group botanical materials. Secondary interest comes from the grid backdrop, which softly frames the arrangement without competing with it. And that's an interesting analysis because I hadn't really thought about that. I in my mind, I was using the wire mesh grid to support the placement of the plant materials, and I just thought it was incorporated into the design. But what the analysis is seeing is that it's secondary interest and that it's framing the arrangement without competing with it. So it's kind of doing what I wanted it to do, but it's doing a little bit more as well. Contrast. Contrast is generated effectively through material choice of rough versus smooth, form contrast of vertical spikes versus rounded seed heads, and the colour contrast of warm brown and yellow hues punctuating the neutral tones. So there's a few different contrasts in there, but it's not overwhelmingly contrasting, so it doesn't jar when we're looking at it. Unity. The design is cohesive with every element contributing to the interpretive theme. The limited colour palette, material repetition and structural lines all unify the composition. I think I mentioned before what we're trying to achieve is unity within the design so that it looks like a complete design, whether that's with the plant material, with the space in between, the negative space in between, the placements, the textural contrast, all of those things still need to be unified in the design. We don't want to be looking at one part that is rough and then another part that is smooth, or one part that's bright colour and another part that isn't. We want it to present as a unified design, and the only way we can do that is by incorporating all of those elements within our interpretation of the design. I love the title, sorry. So the strengths of this design: excellent textural interplay, strong interpretive value. The design conveys a narrative of nature, industry and boundary. Clean, deliberate lines and form choices supporting the design title. Effective use of contrast with a unified colour scheme. So what it's saying in that last one is that although the colour scheme is unified, there are contrasts within that colour scheme. So there's the brighter pop of the Banksia flowers and the Craspedia against the more subtle and subdued tones of the cardboard and the wheat, and then we have the shiny gold in the mesh, though not as clear in the image. And I will say that this analysis obviously is done on the photograph as well, so exactly the same way as the human judges would have been doing it in the online competition. Let's now look at some suggestions for improving the design, and this I'm very interested in these. Clarify the focal area. While the design is harmonious, it could benefit from a more obvious focal point, perhaps by positioning a larger or brighter botanical element slightly off-centre. And I think that's true, and I think that I would really have to play around with the placement to know exactly where I needed it. And you know, when you look at the image, you can't plonk it right. Plonk is a very technical term. Can't put it right in the middle of the mesh, because then your eye would be drawn to the centre and not see, everything else would look extraneous to it. So that's why it's talking about having it slightly off centre. But I'd have to really play with it and think about what I would use and where I would use it. But a good suggestion nonetheless. Consider refinement of the mesh grid. The irregularity in the top outline of the mesh is slightly distracting. Intentionally shaping it might enhance the visual flow. So that's probably, part of that will be due to the image, which is what I talked about right at the beginning. Make sure that you get an image that is exactly the way you want the judges to see the design. So here I've got, must have been light reflecting off it, so I've got some areas that look lighter than others, so it gives the impression of being an irregular shape at the top where it was a straight line. So two things to think about there is getting the light right if I want to leave it the way it is, or taking up this suggestion and shaping the top of that somewhat differently. Edge finishing. Where the cardboard edges meet the base, consider a cleaner finish or elevation to avoid a heavy grounding effect, especially in an edge-themed design. So this is what I talked about with the base, that it should be on a base of some description. Even if it was on another piece of cardboard, like a flat piece of cardboard, it would take it up and away from the black cloth that it's placed on, and so there is that separation between the staging area and the design itself, so the design becomes independent and the judge can look at it as an independent design. As it stands now, that black cloth becomes part of the design, and it does make it very heavy and very grounded on that area where I've placed the design. So that's definitely a suggestion that I would look at taking up and practicing. Overall, for this design, a sophisticated modern design that captures the concept of on the edge through clever material selection, strong linear rhythm, and earthy textured detailing. It successfully conveys a tension between natural and built environments while remaining artistically expressive. With minor refinements, this design has high potential for strong competition placement. So I think just the base, putting the base underneath it, piece of the corrugated cardboard that covered that whole space of where the design is, was going to make so much difference to the actual look of the design. And sometimes that's all you need. Sometimes it's just a tiny change to a design that lifts it from the group to the place getters. So with that, I will leave you to think about your designs for another week, and I'll join you again for our next video. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.